to the King's Russia Institute online. My name is Sam Greene. I teach Russian politics at King's and have the pleasure of running the Russia Institute. I also have the pleasure of welcoming you all to this conversation. I have to say I've been looking forward to this evening for a very long time, not only because it's the last time I have to go to bed in a world in which Donald Trump is my president, but because this is an important topic and I cannot think of a group of people with whom I would rather discuss it than the people we've been able to bring together today. I'm going to make a brief round of introductions and then set the scene before I hand it over to our panelists this evening to get the conversation started. We will then have a Q&A moderated through the chat function here. So please do find that chat function button if you want to ask questions, and we'll get you into the conversation as the evening progresses, or the morning if you happen to be out in California. So we have with us this evening people really who don't need a whole lot of introduction, but I will introduce them anyway. Ruth Deyermond is my colleague at King's College London, where she teaches Russian and post-Soviet security in the Department of War Studies. Also happens to be one of my favorite people to listen to when it comes to the history of U.S.-Russian relations, particularly when it comes to the role of presidents. So if we're going to think about the role that a leadership change in Washington might bring, I'm really looking forward to hearing Ruth's view on that. Out in California, I think, Rose Gottemoeller joins us from Stanford University. Rose was, before joining Stanford, Deputy Secretary General of NATO, before that Undersecretary of State in the Obama administration, with responsibility for, among other things, negotiating the New START treaty. So really a lot of policy experience brought to the table. Before that, the Carnegie Moscow Center, a number of other places. From Moscow and the Carnegie Moscow Center, we're also joined by the center's director, DMitri Trenin, who I know there's a number of my students in the audience. You read a bunch of his work already, including work from Post-Imperium, really one of the most influential books on thinking about Russian foreign policy in the last decade, and there is more to come. Also have to say, just in the interest of full disclosure, that I have had the pleasure of working for Rose and DMitri, so this is an opportunity for me to reconnect with some people I haven't spoken to in quite some time. So again, welcome everybody. I will sort of abuse my role a little bit and just say a few words to try to set the scene. I was making a list this afternoon of sort of agenda items, I guess, for the Biden administration coming in. Obviously, it's a big agenda, but if you just want to focus on things having to do with Russia, we can narrow it down a little bit, right? Navalny ended up at the top of my list. This is in no particular order, but he's been in the news and probably something already that the Biden administration has spoken out about. Trump Russia itself is in the background somewhere, something they're going to have to deal with. The recent, at least alleged, hacking attack on U.S. institutions and businesses, Snowden, Ukraine, Belarus, the Western Balkans, Syria, North Korea, Nagorno-Karabakh, Iran, Turkey, sanctions, Nord Stream, chemical weapons, strategic arms control, rebuilding the relationship with Europe, right? Things operating on different calibers, again, in no particular order, right? But that certainly involve Russia, and that will demand some attention from the Biden administration. I was also thinking about some predictions that I made, and it's always dangerous to make predictions on politics, right? But some predictions that I made in the past, and thinking about whether or not I still feel happy with them. One of which was that I didn't think that any post-Trump administration was going to have an appetite for a significant change in its relationship, in the U.S. relationship with Russia, right? And I mean, I think looking at who we've seen appointed already, right? The Biden does bring in people, right, who in some ways I think have an appetite for getting some stuff done with Russia, right, for working with Russia, and they have some experience working with Russia, and maybe even enjoy working with Russia. But we saw just, I think today or yesterday, a podcast involving Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi, in which it was, the idea was broached maybe of a congressional commission to look into Trump Russia, right? So some of these issues are not going to go away. More, we've seen the news that Parler, right, which has played an important role in organizing the hard right in the U.S. and the recent riots in the Capitol building is now being run off of servers in Russia. So there's a sense that Russia is still, from a Washington perspective, more of a problem than a solution. And that changing the relationship, right, in some degree is going to require wresting the levers of foreign policy making when it comes to Russia away from Congress and back into the executive branch, right? So if you think looking ahead to the midterms, that Biden probably only has about 2 years in which he can work his broad agenda through Capitol Hill, right? Is this an area in which he's going to want to spend valuable political resources, right? Is Russia something that he's going to really want to invest in? And I'm still not convinced about that. The other, I think, prediction looking back at things I had thought before, right, was that I didn't expect to see much appetite in the Kremlin for a change in the relationship. Right? Putin's political advisors and maybe Putin himself tend to perceive confrontation with the West broadly as important to Putin's legitimation. It's one of the reasons that his approval rating spiked after Crimea, and it is something that broadly enjoys a degree of support from the Russian population, certainly more when it comes to the US than it does when it comes to the relationship with Europe, right? But it's there, right? And that might not be an apple cart that they would want to upset. Sanctions also seem to be baked into the economy, and unpicking them, right, and unpicking the counter-sanctions regime, right, could, certainly maybe spur some growth, but would also create new winners and losers, which could have unpredictable political consequences. So again, something that the Kremlin might not want to do. And if we look at the news over the last couple of days, particularly around the treatment of Navalny on his return to Russia, it suggests that Putin is not particularly interested in laying the foundation for anything that would look like a reset, right, with the Biden administration. So on the whole, I think I feel pretty good about those predictions from a few years ago, right? Even if that means I feel pretty badly about the future of the relationship between Russia and the United States. That said, of course, we're in a different world, right, than we were even a year ago, right? A world that has a lot more disease, a lot more disruption, including economic dislocation, a lot more war than I think we felt we did just, again, a year ago, looking at events in Karabakh, which I already mentioned. Right? So does that mean that maybe some of these things on the agenda might need to be seen in a different context than they were some time ago? So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues and my co-panelists to get this conversation started, and we'll start with Ruth Deyermond. Ruth, the floor is yours. Ruth, you should now be able to unmute yourself and speak.
Yes, hopefully. Is that working?
Yes.
Fabulous. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Sam, and thank you for organising such an interesting and timely panel. So I want to talk very briefly about a few things. Sam, when he was putting this panel together, asked us to think about the issue of change in relation to the Biden administration and Russia. And so I've been thinking about the question of change in the US-Russia relationship and the incoming Biden administration. And I guess that I want to make a couple of contextual points. Clearly, compared with the Trump administration, we're going to see very significant change, I think. But looking back beyond, further back beyond the Trump administration, can we expect to see significant change on what's gone before. And broadly speaking, I would say not so much. I wouldn't expect to see a radical break with approaches of the past, except and this is something that Sam has touched on, except in the expectation that there can be a kind of reset, a renewal of the relationship. And that's something that I don't think we see at all now. I mean, the first contextual point that I wanted to make was that there really isn't that much scope for change. I mean, compared with the pre-Trump administration or administrations. So there isn't much scope for change compared with, if we look at what might be likely to happen. We're 30 years after the end of the Cold War and post-Soviet period. We've had 21 years of a Putin presidency. Lavrov has been foreign minister for 16 years. And as Sam has already talked about, we have an incoming American administration that's full of key important figures from previous administrations. So in that regard, I think, everyone is going to be a known quantity to each other. And the agenda and the patterns of interaction and indeed the patterns of conflict are pretty well established. Clearly, Trump broke from this, but not in a good way. His policy towards Russia and his foreign policy generally was chaotic and incoherent, and at least at a rhetorical level. And who knows, in practice, there seemed to be a desperation to have a good relationship with Putin, to an undignified degree for a US president. There was an abandonment of core foreign policy values, and actually quite a lot of aggression on nuclear issues. And clearly there's no sense that Biden is going to want to replicate any of that, right? I think, the other important contextual issue, and this is an issue of difference from earlier this century or the end of the 20th century. Before Trump, previous US administrations' relations with Russia were informed by, at some level, a sense of Russian weakness. And that's not the case now, or not in the same way. Russia is now clearly seen, as Sam was discussing, Russia is clearly seen to present a threat to US democracy, to domestic stability, to the possibility for democratic change in the post-Soviet space. And of course, Russia has a much expanded global role, with which the Biden administration will also need to accommodate itself or think around. In terms of actual kind of policy, change and what's likely to be on the agenda. I mean, as I've said, and as Sam said, it's clear that there's no talk of a reset, right? And expectations for the relationship do seem to be very low on both sides. But perhaps paradoxically, because of this, there is some scope for pragmatic engagement, I would say, an engagement not informed by, even at a kind of rhetorical level, not informed by the idea that the US can transform Russia, that the relationship can be renewed and improved, right? I think that the major area where there's a possibility for pragmatic engagement is arms control. But I will defer to my eminent co-panelist on that, and won't touch on it. But to me, that seems to be the big area for where there's possibility for some kind of pragmatic engagement. But the other major areas are all likely to be very negative for the relationship. I think broadly, we're going to see, I think, a return to a normative element in US policy towards Russia. Human rights and democracy clearly seem, from what we know, to be on the agenda, and they have to be, in a way. The Trump administration's approach was such an abandonment of US policy on questions of human rights and democracy, that's one area where inevitably, I think, and rightly, there will be a re-engagement. And that's, of course, going to cause friction with Russia, with the Russian government. And that will be, I think, a focus not just on democracy and human rights questions in Russia, in relation to Navalny, in relation to other issues, but also in relation to other areas of the post-Soviet space, and Belarus would be the obvious case there. Then clearly the issue of alleged, at least Russian involvement in US politics is going to be a significant factor shaping the way that the Biden administration can interact with Russia and shaping the nature of that relationship. And then beyond specific issues where the US and Russia interact directly, I think the most important feature that will kind of set the agenda for the relationship, or certainly shape the environment in which the relationship develops, is the commitment of the Biden administration to restoring transatlantic relations, to repairing European NATO states' trust in the US as a security partner, which, as we know, has been very badly damaged for the last 4 years. And that clearly is going to transform European security in all sorts of ways, and will therefore have a significant effect on the US-Russia relationship. I just want to kind of finish with a couple of notes on, I suppose, the political context inside the US and Biden himself. So clearly, in internal US discussions about Russia and the way that the administration talks about Russia, we're going to see a very different approach. Because at the most basic level, certainly for many people, although perhaps not for kind of QAnon believers, but for many people, Biden's relationship with Putin is not in itself going to be grounds for suspicion, right? But the relationship with Russia remains a deeply partisan one. So the extent to which partisan politics affects the ability of the Biden administration to, for example, advance an arms control agenda, I think is going to be a key challenge. I would, expect that Congress, both houses, probably are going to support further steps in terms of sanctions against the Russian government. But even that perhaps may be subject to partisan politics, certainly if there is an attempt to introduce sanctions in relation to Russian activity in respect of last week, let's say. I think the final thing I wanted to touch on this is, normally when I talk, I end up saying very pessimistic things. I think there is one area that's a ground for optimism, despite the terrible state of US-Russia relations and the poor prospects for improvement. And I think that's Biden himself, because although I think we need to be very, very wary of historical analogies or comparing political figures with other political figures, there are aspects of Biden that remind me in a positive way of George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., in terms of his huge experience, of course, but also the extent to which he seems to be focused on personal relationships as a mechanism for advancing pragmatic goals. Actually interacting with people in order to reassure them, and to achieve kind of pragmatic outcomes, which I think is something that's going to be very important in relation to the rest of, to the other states of the NATO alliance. But actually, I think it also has the potential to be helpful in the relationship with Russia. So, to the extent that we can think of Biden, in the mold of George Bush Sr., I think that's a potential positive element for the relationship. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for that. I'm going to hand the floor then to Rose to take it forward.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me all right? Very good. Okay, excellent. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Yes, indeed, we did have some good years working together at the Carnegie Moscow Center, and I miss those times. Also, of course, with my colleague DMitri Trenin, we had a really good team in that period. And I know there's still a very good team, which now DMitri is overseeing at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Ruth, it's nice to make your acquaintance, if only in a virtual space. But thank you very much for setting up my remarks, because it won't surprise this audience that I did want to talk about the arms control agenda and how it will change going forward. Sam asked us to focus on elements of change in the U.S.-Russian relationship, and I think we are on the cusp of some major new directions in U.S.-Russia arms control policy. Sam and Ruth have both already referred to the Navalny situation, which I am very concerned about. I think it was absolutely the wrong move to take. I do not know exactly how the Biden team will respond to this once the president-elect is sworn in tomorrow at noon Washington time. But I do know that there will be grave concern about the matter. I do not know how it will affect arms control policy going forward exactly, but I have long argued and will continue to argue that where existential threats to the United States are concerned, that is the threat of nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction in general, that the United States must remain engaged, whether we are talking about the Russian Federation, China, whether we are talking about working with the DPRK and Iran. We may have grave problems with these countries, but because of the existential threat of weapons of mass destruction, we need to continue working with them on limiting and controlling weapons of mass destruction. So in that context, I do believe that one of the first foreign policy acts of President Biden will be to extend the New START treaty, and I welcome very much the signals from Minister Lavrov yesterday that the Russian offer to extend New START for 5 years without conditions remains on the table. And I thought that was a very timely intervention by the foreign minister, and I know that people in Washington took note of it. So I think we are set to extend New START. If people want to talk about the details during the conversation afterwards, I'm happy to do so. But the bottom line is it's written into the treaty. So there doesn't have to be a lot of additional negotiation, nor really a complex mechanism to do so. A simple exchange of diplomatic notes, at least from the US perspective, will suffice to extend the treaty. So we will see, but I am confident that it can be done in the 2 weeks available, as long as both Washington and Moscow are ready to do so. What comes next? That's where the change will occur, and that's where I think the more interesting activity will arise. It may surprise the listeners today, but I think the Trump administration did us a favor in two important ways by putting on the table two important principles. The first and most important from my perspective is the principle of directly limiting warheads. For the longest time, we have been hoping and looking for ways to limit warheads directly, but it's been too difficult because it's been too difficult to monitor and verify limitations imposed on warheads held in very sensitive storage facilities and operational sites. So it's always been, as I call it, the holy grail of nuclear arms control, to directly limit warheads. Instead, we've limited warheads by limiting the delivery vehicles that they are deployed on. You take an ICBM out of deployment and you destroy it, you put those warheads in storage, they are no longer a direct threat to anybody, to the United States, to Russia, etc. So that's how we've limited warheads in the past, but the Trump administration, by proposing a freeze on all nuclear warheads and getting President Putin to agree to it at the highest level, has really, I think, established the principle that we should be directly limiting warheads. And I think that's a good step. Now, the Trump team tried to push it too far by insisting early that the Russians agree on verifying this freeze. It was the correct thing to do, turning a unilateral freeze into an actual negotiated limit with verification measures attached. But the notion of trying to rush that so quickly, I do understand that the Russian side did not agree to being rushed into what's a highly technical and sensitive matter. But I do think that this is fertile ground for a new negotiation between the United States and Russia directly limiting warheads, as well as further reducing delivery vehicles and launchers. So I do think this, frankly, is an exciting step. If it can be taken, it means that we will be moving in a new direction in nuclear arms control that we have long sought, but not had the opportunity to pursue. So that's a very good step. The second principle that the Trump administration established is that China should come to the negotiating table. Again, I think they went about it the wrong way by insisting that China should come to the table of strategic arms reduction. Well, that's ridiculous. The United States and Russia still have many times the strategic nuclear force posture that China has. Just by way of example, under New START, the United States and Russia are allowed to deploy 1,550 warheads each. According to the Department of Defense's study released in September, this is the US Department of Defense, China only has a total of about 250 warheads. So you can see the huge disparity between the two sides. It doesn't make sense to try to drive them to the strategic arms reduction table. Yes, we must watch their modernization closely. They are modernizing, and we must be aware if they are suddenly beginning to expand numbers. But these are the types of moves on the part of China about which we will have plenty of warning. We will have plenty of strategic warning if they are suddenly sprinting to join the United States and Russian Federation in terms of numbers of nuclear warheads and delivery vehicles. So how to engage China then? What's important to them? What would bring them to the negotiating table? My view is that here we should look at a follow-on negotiation regarding intermediate range forces, intermediate range missiles. The INF treaty went away in 2019. I regretted it very much, but I am convinced, as are all NATO allies and US allies in Asia, that Russia has been violating the INF treaty with the development and deployment of the 9M729 intermediate range ground-launched missile. And this has been a matter of grave concern. Once a treaty is hollowed out by a violation of that extent, then it makes no sense to continue in it. So we were, I think, safe to say, kind of forced into this action. But what do we do now? Because the problem is a continuing proliferation of intermediate range missiles all around the Eurasian periphery. And that could include new US ground-launched cruise missiles coming to be deployed in Europe and Asia going forward. The Russian Federation has announced an interesting, I would say, evolution of the moratorium they proposed on bringing new intermediate range missiles to Europe. The first time they tried it, I was still at NATO in August and September of 2019, and it was a very one-sided proposal. It only would have affected the US new ground-launched cruise missiles that have not yet been deployed, but it would keep them from being deployed in future. The Russians were not willing to put the 9M729 on the table for the moratorium. Now, the new proposal that President Putin articulated in October is an improvement, because although they do not admit that the 9M729 flies to intermediate ranges, they have said that it would be part of a new moratorium. Putin has said that the 9M729 would not be deployed in European Russia under this proposal, and the US would, of course, be asked or required under the proposal not to deploy the new ground-launched cruise missile. So this is something worth looking at. Putin also said it should involve monitoring and verification measures, also very important development in this moratorium offer. So now that takes care of European Russia. What about east of the Urals? I think we might get the Chinese attention with a moratorium in Europe, because Russia would be moving the 9M729 presumably east of the Urals, so there would be more intermediate range missiles in Asia, and the United States still plans at the present time to deploy a new ground-launched cruise missile in Asia. And so this might interest the Chinese, that they could be facing more potent intermediate range missile threats, and so could be willing to come to the negotiating table for initially discussions, and in the longer term, some limiting negotiations. We will see, but here is where I think we ought to place our emphasis. Also a very exciting new direction if we are drawing the Chinese into discussions and eventually into negotiations to limit such missiles. So those are two, I would say, new directions that I think we should pursue. And we will see now that everybody's interested in further talking about strategic stability topics, Russia and the United States. There's so many new technologies out there, whether it's new missile defense technologies or hypersonic glide vehicles, the advent of new technologies in the cyber and AI realms. All of these are, I think, worthy topics. Space, another topic. All of these are worthy topics for further discussion in strategic stability talks. Before I hand back the floor, Sam, I just wanted to note, maybe because I just want to get a rise out of DMitri Trenin, the demise of the conventional arms control regimes in Europe. Russia last week announced it was going to withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty. The US has already notified a withdrawal. To my mind, and I said publicly last week, this is a shame because the problems with implementation of the Open Skies Treaty can be fixed. They are, not insurmountable, but it will take some hard work. And frankly, I've been a bit surprised because Russia sank such a great investment into new Open Skies aircraft and new digital sensors. So I'm surprised that Russia was so ready to throw the treaty away. So we need to do some work on the conventional arms control regimes in Europe, whether it's on Open Skies, on the CFE treaty, or on the Vienna document. And I do hope, in addition to the nuclear agenda, that we can spend some time thinking about the future of the conventional regimes in Europe as well. So thank you very much, Sam, for this opportunity. I've been the arms control nerd that I always am in my remarks. If your listeners would like to ask other questions, I was the signer of an important letter on the U.S.-Russia relationship that appeared in Politico back in the summer. I'm happy to talk about that broader set of issues as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rose. There's a lot in there, very rich. Thank you for that, but also a lot of questions. And I will bite my tongue for the moment, but we'll get there hopefully. DMitri, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, for making me part of your program today. And it's a great opportunity to see you and Rose and to meet Ruth virtually. Thank you very much for that. It was a pleasure then. It is certainly a pleasure now. I think all important things have been said. Basically, what I can do is to confirm that expectations in Moscow are about as high as they are in Washington or in London, for that matter. I think that the state of relations can be best described by the word confrontation. This confrontation will continue. It's different than the Cold War, but it is dangerous, more dangerous than most people, I think, realize. And the only issue on the agenda, really important issue, in which both sides remain interested, is preventing an inadvertent kinetic collision between the United States and Russia, which unfortunately can happen out of an incident here, out of miscalculation there, misperception in a third place. So it's a bad relationship which is not getting better. The only thing we need to focus on really is guardrails that would prevent the relationship from sliding into the abyss of a collision. I think that there are changes, clearly. They are not fundamental, because fundamentally this will remain confrontation. The changes are significant. There will be more unity in the United States government, more unity between the White House and the U.S. Congress, clearly, more unity within the administration. In that sense, the United States government will be more predictable. And of course, there'll be, in many ways, more professional people in charge of important things. There's going to be more unity, and as people in Moscow say, on an anti-Russian basis between the United States on the one hand and its allies in Europe and in Asia on the other side, and this will come again at the expense of Russian, Russian government's interests. There was a hope, which I think is now being dispelled, that the departure of Donald Trump will mean that Russia will cease to be this political football in the United States that's been kicked around the political field by both teams. It's likely to stay in that uncomfortable role for 4 more years. And I think what I've heard today confirms that. There is a new thing, which is, again, something that many of you have alluded to. There's going to be more friction regarding domestic political issues, internal issues. But I think this time it's going to be a two-way street. So Russia will, and I think we've just heard that with regard to Parler and other things. Russia will fight back against what the Kremlin believes is a Western campaign of interference with the most important thing in Russian politics these days, the early stages of transition to some kind of post-Putin configuration. Navalny's homecoming is seen as part of that interference by the West. And even today, you hear Russia raising the issue of democracy and human rights in the United States from the Duma floor. So there'll be more of that. And I think that there will be certainly more friction. Both the United States and Russia will spend the next 4 years in a domestic environment, which will be, let's say, more volatile than was the thing in the past, certainly in the United States, and that it has been in Russia in the last several years. So there'll be more nervousness. There'll be more willingness to use pretty strong methods to defend the existing system against interference from the other party. I think this also extends to, again, something that has been mentioned here, extends to some countries on Russia's periphery, former Soviet states, whether it's Belarus or Ukraine or Moldova or you name it. There are lots of candidates for that, where the United States and Russia can, again, come to political blows. I agree with Rose that the only area where cooperation can be imagined is arms control. And of course, she is the top expert in the United States and one of the top experts around the world. And I think that she gave a very realistic picture of what to expect there. But in the environment that we have all painted, I think it will be very difficult to expect new talks that will hopefully start after the extension of the START treaty to be formalized in some kind of a negotiation, and it will be difficult to, at least for me, to expect those negotiations to yield a result before the end of the 4 years of the current mandate of Joe Biden. So it's, as I said, it's a pretty difficult relationship. But the only thing to worry about is not that there is little opportunity for a new reset. Just forget it. It's clearly not going to happen. The most important thing to focus on is guardrails that would make this confrontation safe, or at least safe from a direct military collision between the two powers. Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, DMitri. Thanks to all of the panelists. I'm going to open it up in a moment to questions from the audience. We've got more than 150 people here, so I imagine there's going to be quite a number of questions. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of you who have already begun to post them. So please do post them to the chat, and I will sort through them and we'll try to get through as many as we can. In the meantime, I would ask if you have your camera on and you're not a presenter, to please turn it off so that we can manage the bandwidth. But as the questions come in, I do want to throw out a couple of my own, just to clarify some things that I heard, and maybe even a little bit about we didn't hear. DMitri, sorry, when I said turn your camera off, I didn't mean you. So please do come back if you're able to. But I guess I'm wondering about two things, or maybe two interrelated things. One, since we are sitting, now on the outskirts of Europe, no longer in the European Union, sitting here, at least where I am in the UK. We didn't talk about Europe much in this conversation. I think there is a broad understanding, right, that there is this is a multi-party relationship, right, and that whatever happens between Moscow and Washington will have implications for what can happen involving Europe as well, right? So I guess if you're looking at this from the Washington perspective, what I'm wondering is how much does Russia matter for what is clearly, as Ruth said, the stated intention of the Biden administration to rebuild the relationship with Europe? From the European perspective, right? How much does Washington's relationship with Moscow matter, right? In terms of that effort, right? But also from Moscow's perspective, right? Is it possible for Moscow to pursue a relationship with Europe independent of what happens in the relationship with Washington? I think I'll leave it at there. There's tons of things I want to ask about, including some NATO issues, but we'll get there because there's a lot of questions coming in. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on the panel immediately on any of those issues. We're going to get Europe into the conversation for a moment. Ruth, oh, sorry, Rose, go ahead.
Since the question was about Washington, at least initially, I'll say a word about that. I was taken by DMitri's comment. The only issue is preventing inadvertent kinetic collision between U.S. and Russia. I frankly think, and this is something I'd like your comment on as well, DMitri, that the real-time, day in, day out issue now is, yes, we need to prevent kinetic collision, but the fact that there is collision going on in the hybrid space, in the gray space constantly now, is adding a constant and serious irritant to the relationship, whether it's such steps as taking over hosting the Parler site or being engaged and involved in cyber intrusion. And of course, we're all very concerned about the major cyber intrusion that was discovered before the holidays took place. And that will continue. Those kinds of things are just, they are a serious and continuing irritant. So I think, frankly, we haven't talked at all today about that world, but it's speaking about NATO. That's what we were seeing at NATO as well, that day in, day out. This is, in a way, it's nothing new. The Soviet Union was constantly looking for ways below the kinetic threshold to destabilize, to interfere, to separate one NATO ally from the other. So it's nothing new, but it's become really kind of supercharged with the advent of the information age and the ability to use cyber instruments of various kinds to meddle and to cause serious problems. So I think it's that severe day in, day out irritation, that those irritants that we also need to think about. Is it possible that we can somehow begin to get a handle on that severe and constant irritation? I'm not convinced we can at the moment, but I think that's also a worthy area to at least consider for the policy arena.
Do you want me to comment on that, Sam, or shall I comment later?
Please do, DMitri. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think it's well, certainly it is a major issue. We hear about Russian interference in the United States, but maybe due to Russia's political culture, we hear We don't hear anything about Russia being made transparent to the United States, which I think it is. I think Russia is more transparent to the US, just for very obvious reasons. Many in Russia use American software, American hardware, and clearly there's a huge security risk that Russia faces and cannot get rid of, frankly. So, and the Russian government, for the reasons that it knows, doesn't really spell them out, is not reporting about successful Western operations against its own interests. So what I see is, and for its own part, as you mentioned, Rose, there was a Putin statement also on cyber issues. Like you, I'm very skeptical on what can be done with regard to cyber. I don't think that the Biden administration will simply accept Putin's offer of resuming the contacts that the United States and Russia used to have during the Obama administration. Not very fruitful contacts, to be sure, on cyber issues. I think cyber is such a politically delicate or explosive or toxic, whatever you want to call it, issue in the United States that absent a very genuine Russian apology followed by measures that would prevent anything like that from happening in the future and verification mechanism to make sure that those measures work. A new round of cyber talks is unlikely to begin. So I think we will have to live with that. But having said all that, I still believe that cyber is, unless it goes too far, and I think that people more or less understand where too far lies, cyber is not going to bring us to war, whereas military collisions, kinetic collisions, are more likely to do so than cyber. So that would be my comment. I agree. It's a major irritant. It's a new battlefield. It's a new area of not just military but also political confrontation between the United States and Russia.
Thanks, Ruth. Did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, just very briefly, and really a comment about that very last thing that Deyermond said, which is the political aspect of this. And I think one of the big challenges for not just for the US-Russia relationship, but actually for US politics more generally, the US democracy, is engaging with the extent of Russian involvement in domestic politics now, not just in the sense of disruptive activities, hacking and things in that area, but also the way that the elements of the American right now seem to have found a kind of bond of kind of political commonality in some areas with the Russian government. And so you see the elements of the American right using the kind of language of delegitimation that you also hear coming out of the Russian government. Most notoriously perhaps in the autumn, when the expectation about unrest in relation to the elections, at least Fox News's expectations about unrest concerned possible Democrat unrest, when Trump was re-elected. There was talk about whether the Democrats were using kind of color revolutions technology, right? So we see, some of the language and the delegitimizing ideas that you see from the Russian government coming into discussion on Fox News, for instance, and that I think is, it's a huge irritant in the relationship, and it's very hard to see how the Biden administration or the US generally can dig their way out of that or address that. I just very, very briefly wanted to come back to your question about how much Washington's relationship with Moscow matters for Europe. And for me, I think it matters hugely, not least because it's about trust. I mean, there have been, I would say, serious questions in Europe in the last 4 years about the Trump administration's commitment to NATO. And that obviously is the kind of major factor causing disturbance in the US-Europe relationship. And you're just not going to get that same question in relation to the Biden administration. So, and obviously the relationship with Moscow is intimately tied into that. So I think it's hugely important. It's going to be reassuring, more than almost anything else, perhaps.
Great, thank you very much to all of you. There is a question in the chat that relates to something actually that Rose and DMitri were just batting back and forth a moment ago, which is cyber, right? So Dara McDowell asks what expectations you have for arms control, or even setting the terms of engagement in cyberspace, right? For example, distinguishing cyber attacks versus cyber espionage, distinguishing legitimate targets, and so on. Is there sufficient common ground to even start the conversation? And I think, DMitri, I think I could interpret your comments to say that you don't think there is. I wonder, Rose, whether or not you think that there might be.
Well, DMitri pointed to the important work that was done, not only in the last administration, but even prior to that, by the UN group of government experts. And there's more recently been not only a GGE going on, but also some additional work going on under the UN aegis. So, there has been some, I would say, mutual understanding developed of where we might have some confidence building measures, where we might cooperate on, identifying and mitigating attacks, et cetera. These are baby steps, and DMitri's right from that perspective. But in the context of those GGEs and other specialist discussions, I think a sense has developed, which President Putin's announcement or statement picked up on, that is that we need to work on this space in a normative way as well, and try to begin to develop some sense of no-go zones, proper behavior versus improper behavior. Frankly, I think the easiest place to start, and this is a very difficult area, because we are not limiting hardware in any way, shape, or form. What we've done over all these years in nuclear arms control has been to limit big hardware. And that's been easy to see even from outer space, from our satellites in outer space. Now we are proceeding in the arms control space to smaller objects such as warheads. That's much more complicated. And when we look elsewhere at the emergence of new technologies, we're really thinking about how to limit and steer the use of software. And that's extraordinarily difficult. I don't agree with the term cyber arms control. I think it makes no sense because it confuses people. It makes them think somehow we'll be limiting something like hardware, but it's going to have to be a much different procedure and process. But I do think an early place to begin is non-interference with national command authorities. None of us have any interest. Moscow, Washington, Beijing, nobody has any interest in the national command capabilities being damaged or attacked, destroyed at the onset of crisis or conflict. So non-interference with NCA, I think, would be a good place to start. But I'd be very interested in DMitri's views on this issue as well.
If I may,
Sure.
As I said, I think that Russia would be, I think, they recognize as well as people in the United States that there are certain no-go areas, and it makes a lot of sense for both sides, both parties, to agree on not going beyond certain red lines. And I think that Russia, and I take Putin's word to be an indicator of that, Russia is ready to begin such talks with the United States. I think that the problem is that under the Trump administration, you would recall that at Helsinki, they tried to set up a group to look into these issues, but because of the way that the Helsinki press conference went on, because of the domestic issues in the United States because of accusations against Trump and his so-called collusion with Russia, this was a non-starter. Whether it is possible for the Biden administration to start discussing these issues with the Russians without asking Russia for a mea culpa, for a statement of guilt, of statement of admission of interference in U.S. politics. If there's no precondition of that kind, I think Russia should be ready to sit down and have that discussion. Whether politically this would be acceptable to the United States to deal with an unapologetic Russia, even in an area where it makes sense for the United States and Russia to come to terms, is an open question, and I don't have the answer to that.
Thank you. I think that to a certain extent also answers Stephen Dalziel's question about whether Putin is likely to ever let us know what it was that structured his relationship with Trump personally. But I want to stay on security for a moment, because there's a question from Carl Seivitz about what the guardrails might look like and what guardrails might be achievable in terms of the U.S.-Russia relationship. DMitri, this was something you mentioned earlier, so I wonder if I might throw that to you.
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward, pretty obvious. I think that communication, regular contacts, direct lines between top military chiefs, top security officers, other important people, to make sure that an incident doesn't degenerate into a conflict, that a conflict once started could be brought to a standstill fairly quickly, say another flare-up in Donbass becoming something bigger and threatening a direct war between Russia and Ukraine. Or something happening in Syria, or something happening over the Black Sea or over the Baltic Sea or somewhere else, so that these incidents do not escalate to the level when we have become engaged in a small conflict, which of course can expand and then go to the level where no one in the world should want it to go. So this is one. Another thing is a series of agreements between the United States and Russia, or Russia and NATO, on confidence building measures, on procedures to make sure that the incidents I referred to at the beginning do not happen. I think that this is also the guardrails also would include arms control that would give confidence to both parties that the other side is not doing something that could overturn the existing balance between the United States and Russia, so that you have the value of the treaty is not in the principal value is not in the numbers that are frozen at certain levels or are constrained by certain agreed levels, but rather in the verification procedures that permit people on both sides to actually come and see what the situation is in the other country's arsenal, and that gives you confidence. Then you do not engage in your worst nightmares, but rather you deal with the reality of it all. I think that we're talking about these issues, and then I would add to that some kind of a strategic stability dialogue. Even if it doesn't lead to specific agreements, would give both parties a first-hand experience with the other party's thinking, So how Americans think about strategic stability. Of course, they will not divulge all their secrets. They will not lay out all their strategic plans to you, but you will have a way to understand what they think and how they view their national security. Similarly for Russia. And that, I think, is something that would inform a more realistic thinking, more realistic strategizing in both capitals.
Rose, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't think so. I was fascinated by that, DMitri, so thank you. I had that same question myself, and I thank the questioner for bringing it up. But it seems to imply, in answer to my bringing up conventional arms control and the future of conventional arms control, that we should return to focusing on transparency and confidence building plus incident response, and perhaps enhanced communications links, such as the various levels of hotlines that we had in Syria, for example, and focus in that area. I happen to agree that the conventional arms control in Europe worked, and that the numbers of conventional forces are way down now. And so I happen to agree with you that I don't think we should be emphasizing limits going forward, but rather looking for ways to ensure and develop mutual predictability and confidence. So thank you for that. Very interesting indeed.
Thank you. There are a number of questions in the chat about what, for lack of a better word, I'm going to call it the Eastern neighborhood, the space between the EU and Russia. Obviously, recent events, elections in Moldova, bringing a new government to power, the war in Karabakh, the events, ongoing events, obviously in Belarus, but also in Ukraine. I think that the questions have different perspectives on these, but they all I think are wondering what we might expect from the Biden administration, right? In terms of a return to an interest in this part of the world in a way that the Trump administration clearly did not have an interest. Ruth, you already mentioned, both a return to really valuing the relationship with NATO and with Europe, but also a return to valuing issues of human rights and democracy, or at least rhetorically valuing them, right? Which some people would argue and have argued, right, that is misunderstandings of how to deal with those issues might have landed us in some of the situations that we have, right? What might we expect from the Biden administration? Have lessons been learned from things that have been done in the past, or are we going to see a return to more direct competition from Washington with Moscow in the Eastern neighborhood?
I mean, I think it's going to be impossible to avoid competition in a sense, simply because I can't see any circumstances under which the Biden administration are going to neglect what's going on in Belarus, for example, or if the Russian government, starts to express its views about the new Moldovan government kind of more forcibly. Clearly you would expect the Biden administration to respond, and this is firstly, because of the some of the individuals that we know are going to be in the Biden administration, right? But also, I think, after the Trump administration and their rejection of any kind of language about democracy and human rights in relation to this region, really, almost completely and total rejection of it from Trump himself. The Biden administration has to be vocal about this. I don't see any circumstance under which they can avoid that, and so that is, this is now so baked in as an idea, a site of competition. The Russian view of that, governmental view of that, I think, has to be that this will be interference. As I say, particularly given some of the personnel in the administration, associated with, for example, Euromaidan. So I think any moves by the Biden administration in that direction, and I think those moves are inevitable, will be read as aggression, will be read as competition. I think there's no way around that.
Rose, I wonder. I mean, I think Ruth is, among other people, maybe referring obliquely to Victoria Nuland, and which takes us back to Ukraine and the Euromaidan. And I wonder if I can ask you to put your NATO hat on for a second, right? Because I think following on from this, some of the questions are asking to what extent are EU and European policies in the Eastern neighborhood still viable, given everything that has happened, both from sort of the Euromaidan onwards, given where we are now in the relationship with Washington and with Moscow. But I'm wondering in particular about how much water has passed under the bridge in the last 4 years between Washington and Brussels, right? Because there were clearly differences between Washington and Europe when it came to the Euromaidan, and Victoria Nuland, was part of that conversation, right? But there seemed to be at least a level of trust and common purpose. Clearly, the Biden administration is not a continuation of the Trump administration, but I wonder whether or not, right, we return to the status quo ante, and there remains a sense of common purpose between Washington and Europe when it comes to the Eastern neighborhood, or whether the European allies now may be minded to look at Washington's role in the region somewhat differently than they did in the past.
Well, Sam, I think a tsunami has passed under the bridge since the Trump administration came to power, but nevertheless, I would like to point out a couple of things that bespeak continuity. First, so many members of the Eastern neighborhood are actually members of NATO now, if you include the Eastern neighborhood as having former members of the Warsaw Pact in it. So, it's been, I think, impressive to me as Deputy Secretary General of NATO how quickly those countries who are former members of the Warsaw Pact have assimilated into NATO, have acquired and modernized their armed forces in order to be interoperable with NATO, are operating with NATO, for example, in the battle groups in the 3 Baltic states and Poland, and of course regularly exercise at all levels with the NATO alliance. So there is a certain, I would say, military operational reality that is there and has only continued to grow and develop even with Trump's big attacks on NATO, and that's what has made it so difficult for NATO, the disconnection between Washington and Brussels over the past 4 years. But in terms of the way NATO has developed and drawn further in the Eastern neighbors who were members of the Warsaw Pact, developed good cooperation with them and really made them part of the team, I think that has continued unabated. I'll tell you, when I got to NATO in October of 2016, they had just agreed at Warsaw to put in place the 4 battle groups. And I said to myself, we're never going to get these battle groups up and running in a year. But within a year, by July of 2017, they were all certified and ready to carry out their mission, should it have been necessary. So I do think that that's an important point to remember. Then people say, well, what about those who are not members of NATO? Well, here I want to point out that NATO has very strong and intense partnerships with many countries, Georgia and Ukraine, of course, on the list for eventual NATO membership, but the Western Balkans countries, even countries such as Serbia, are partners of Russia. Serbia plays a very delicate balancing game between Moscow and NATO. We understand that as NATO DSG. I certainly understood that in my several visits to Serbia. But I guess all I'm trying to say is that I think in restoring the relationship with NATO now, the Biden administration will simply be underscoring and reemphasizing those relationships with the NATO allies who are in East and Central Europe and with NATO partners who are throughout the region. So I'm rather optimistic from that perspective. There will be an attention span problem. There are so many demands on the Biden administration. But as far as Europe is concerned, I am rather confident that we will see a reemphasis and a re-energizing, certainly of the relationship with NATO headquarters, but also with individual NATO members and partners.
And you would think that would extend to coordination on questions like the South Caucasus or Ukraine or Belarus if it should come to that?
Oh, I think so. I think there will be a strengthened coordination. Now, NATO members always complain, non-US NATO members always complain that Washington does not consult at all or does not consult adequately. But I do think that there will be just much better lines of communication between Washington and Brussels and between individual NATO capitals and Washington. So I do think that there will be more opportunities for consultation. There's one interesting facet here, and that is that the Trump administration went all out to support Belarus. Not all out in terms of supplying them with any kind of boots on the ground, heaven forbid. But it was interesting to me the way, Secretary of State Pompeo went out there. I never would have predicted to see that while I was still in the Obama administration. So there was a certain, I would say, level of support for Belarus that was very interesting to observe.
Okay, I want to move the geography south. There's a question from a King student, actually, Tony Badra, on the Middle East. Essentially, reinterpret the question, but wondering, what happens now, right? With the Biden administration, there is a very complex constellation of interests on the ground in Syria and around Syria. And I wonder, DMitri, does the advent of a Biden administration change at all Moscow's calculations when it thinks about how it moves forward in Syria and the Middle East more broadly?
Well, I think, Sam, and this pertains both to the Middle East and to Europe. Russians were not so much heeding Trump's words or Trump's moves. Rather, they were looking at the things on the ground. And as Rose said very correctly, even as Trump was casting doubt on the value of NATO to the United States, what the Russians saw was deployment of more US and other NATO forces, symbolic at this stage, but very, very, very strategically positioned to localities in the Baltic states and in Poland. So in NATO's infrastructure was moving all the way to the borders of the former Soviet Union, and in the case of the Baltic states, inside the former Soviet Union. So basically, NATO was not seen as doing nothing or unraveling in the years of Trump. Just the opposite. In case of the Middle East, again, Trump's discussion of withdrawal of U.S. forces. These withdrawals have taken place, but they were, from the Russian standpoint, they were not. They did not equate, or they did not signify a U.S. withdrawal from the region. The United States is very much present in Syria. Very much present elsewhere in the Middle East. The good thing about the United States and Russia in Syria is that the deconfliction mechanism between the two militaries is functioning fairly well. Unlike communication between Russia and several other local players or regional players, such as Turkey, Israel, and Damascus itself. And Russia lost people due to miscalculation, due to rogue action or covertly approved actions by the countries in the region, not from the United States. That's important. So deconfliction works there. Otherwise, I think that the United States, although the emphasis now is very much on other regions, the Middle East will stay as one of the three regions on the periphery of the Eurasian continent that the United States not only cares about but has presence in, and Russia certainly will take that into account. Moreover, the United States is I think is expected to take a more proactive stance under the Biden administration in the Middle East, and that I think will lead to a bit more friction between Russian interests and U.S. interests in various parts of the Middle East. I see, frankly, not much room for cooperation, but some room for friction and hopefully not conflict, hopefully not collision.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, and there's still a lot of questions. So I want to, again, combine some of them and see if we can hit on some of these other issues that people are raising. Andreas Schwab is asking about sanctions, right? Should we expect? We mentioned some of the other things happen. Valny, people are condemning and expressing grave concern. We'll have to see what happens as his trial moves forward. If he's sentenced to another 3.5 years in prison, we might expect a reaction there. Obviously, there's the hack or alleged hack, such as it was in the U.S., that is still sort of floating around the policy space, waiting for a response. So, should we be expecting more sanctions coming from Washington? Related to that, there's a question from Jonathan about Nord Stream 2, right? Something the Trump administration focused on, both its policy vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Europe. Should we expect the Biden administration to stick to that, or to switch tactics, and what impact might that have on the relationship with Europe, with Germany in particular? I don't know if anybody wants to dive into.
Well, I have to admit I'm not the biggest expert on sanctions policy, but I do know one thing, that the Biden administration will want to keep in place sanctions that are in place. I know there have been some questions raised about whether the EU, for example, would see any diminution in U.S. interest in sanctions in the Biden administration, and I think that the same focus will be there, and perhaps given all that is happening and has happened, there will be some new sanctions coming into play. I just cannot predict myself exactly what form they will take. I do know also one thing, though, and that is many in the administration, as we discussed in our political letter back in the summer, we as signers of the letter, we're looking for ways, and I believe the administration will be looking for ways to make sanctions smarter, because sanctions only are effective if the country getting sanctioned believes there's some way to get out of them. So, clear steps, clearly defined what is required for sanctions to be lifted. I think that notion of smart sanctions, here loosely described by me, will be something that the Biden administration is keen to look at. At least that's my understanding of their intention.
Can I?
Ruth. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to follow up Rose's very interesting comments, and I think this is going to be a real problem because it's very hard, I think, actually to devise smart sanctions. I mean, it's not something that governments historically have been good at. It's not something that the US government has been good at. The fact that the Jackson-Vanik Amendment persisted for more than 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union is indicative of the problems that you can end up with in relation to sanctions, because even if administrations want to lift sanctions, Congress may have other views on the matter, and that can make things extremely difficult. I would expect more sanctions, simply because clearly the ongoing situation with Navalny, the evolving situation with Belarus still, situations are going to occur which the Biden administration is going to have to take a firm position on, a firm public position on, in a much more coordinated and coherent way than the Trump administration ever did. As Rose rightly said, Pompeo did speak out about Belarus, but of course Trump himself and the White House tended to avoid those kinds of questions, which created an incoherence in the Trump administration on these questions. But you're not going to see that with Biden, the Biden administration. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether sanctions occur or there's an attempt to push through sanctions in response to Russian activity inside the US. I mean, so sanctions in relation to what's happening to Navalny, you could imagine bipartisan support for that. Sanctioning Russia because of US domestic interference, I think, is now a partisan issue, and that's going to make it much more difficult. So I think sanctions in some areas look much more viable than in others.
Thanks, DMitri. Yeah.
Well, I very much agree that sanctions are not only likely to stay, but they are going to be more targeted, more strategic. They would be designed to hurt more. Where I would disagree is that smarter sanctions would offer a way out. I think that the Russian leadership has concluded that the only way out of the present predicament with the United States is surrendering themselves to the mercy of Washington, which is not going to happen. So sanctions will stay, they will expand, they will hurt more, and I think that they will be countered, not necessarily by sanctions, but by other means. We talked about cyber. Cyber attack is as good a means to counter adversarial sanctions as any. Russia does not have the means to respond in kind, so it will have to use the means that are at its disposal. With regard to Nord Stream 2, I think it's dead in the water, literally. I believe that the Biden administration will lean on Germany, and I don't think that Germany will actually withstand the pressure. And Germany itself is not united on that issue. So even if a miracle happens and Nord Stream 2 is built, is completed, it is unlikely that it will actually pump gas into Europe. American sanctions on Europe will be so prohibitive that no one will take that gas from the Europeans. So I think I'm good on both counts. Sanctions will stay and will expand. Nord Stream 2 is, as far as I'm concerned, not going to happen. And cyber attacks are likely to be among the means Russia will use in response to sanctions.
Thank you. There are a lot more questions out there about China, about climate change, about Navalny, about lots of other things. We're not going to get the chance to get to them, but these are all live issues that we will keep talking about. So I will just ask the panelists if you've got anything you want to say in closing, maybe anything you didn't get to say, or anything you think that people ought to hear just in the last couple of minutes. And I think I'll go in the order that we started. So Ruth, do you want to close it off?
No, I mean, really the only thing that I want to say, I suppose, is to reiterate, what I said at the beginning, that actually the scope for change in the relationship is extremely limited for all sorts of reasons, structural reasons, the agenda, personalities, but really that if we're going to avoid a deterioration of the relationship, it's going to require a degree of pragmatic, limited engagement, and I think that is something that it seems to me that the Biden administration is well set up to do. But the real challenge will be, kind of selling that domestically and internationally, and negotiating the very delicate line between, improving the relationship particularly in the arms control area, of course, and attracting criticism for seeming to be giving too much to Russia. So that's the real challenge for them, I think.
Thanks, Rose.
Thank you, Ruth. I wanted to pick up on your notion of a pragmatic, limited relationship because, frankly, I do find it somewhat alarming, DMitri, the notion that we are in a standoff, that sanctions will not go away, and therefore cyber attacks will continue. I don't think I'm overstating the standoff that causes in terms of an ever spiraling negative relationship. So I continue to hope that we can have some pragmatic and limited moves forward, finding some solutions, for example, to the conflict in the eastern Donbass, and looking for ways to actually make the Minsk process work. It seems to me there have been indications that the Biden team is willing to engage more than certainly the Trump team was willing to engage. So let us look for some areas of pragmatic engagement, perhaps limited at first, but perhaps expandable, because arms control, as much as I love it, is not enough to bear the weight of the relationship on its shoulders. And in order to make progress in that realm, we need to be able to make at least some limited progress in a pragmatic way, useful for both countries and also for the larger global security environment. We need to make some progress in that way. Thanks, Sam. Great discussion today. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. And DMitri, close it off.
Well, I would love to associate myself with Rose's remarks. I'm not that optimistic. I hope that we could find more areas for pragmatic interaction outside of the arms control area. But again, my expectation, my most, let's say, realistic expectation is to hope for a safer confrontation. And I think that, frankly, the issue of Donbass, I see little chance of the Minsk agreement being implemented. And the most important thing about Minsk, I believe, is that for the more active forces within Ukraine, this is just an act of high treason. And they always hated Minsk, which was signed at the time when the Ukrainian forces were decimated at Debaltseve. I see little chance of that being resolved in any way. What I'm worried about, frankly, is Ukraine, Moldova, Romania making common cause over Transnistria, and then pinning the small Russian contingent in that area, and forcing Russia to take some kind of an action. And I worry about the implications of that. So to me, Donbass is something that I think will be on the back burner. The best that can happen is that no one dies in the next couple of years. But I worry about Transnistria. I certainly do.
Thank you. Well, lots to think about there. I think what I'm hearing, right, is that to some degree, right, we're stuck in this relationship in ways that it's become very predictable, right, predictably bad, right, but predictable. And maybe if there's something to be happy about, it's that after what we've lived through in the last 4 years, predictable might not be a bad thing. Right? It might make it easier to make better decisions, even if they are limited decisions. So I'll try to end on that note, but we will keep diving into a lot of these issues as we do at King's and at the Russia Institute. So thank you very much to Ruth, to Rose, and DMitri for spending the evening or the morning in California with us today. It's been tremendously educational and a lot of fun and wonderful to see. All of you, even if only in these screens. I hope we get a chance to do it soon enough in another kind of venue. Thank you to all of you for being with us this evening. This will be uploaded on YouTube and available via social media if you want to relive any of the highlights or take careful notes about anything that was said, because this was a rich discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and stay tuned for more events to come, and see you all soon.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you, Rose. Thank you, Ruth. Goodbye.
Yes, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Happy New Year to all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Happy New Year. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.